I was forgetting words. And so literally every fifth or sixth word in a sentence I would forget. And it would be silly things like I'd be sitting at the dining table and I'd be going, can someone pass me the silver thing with the 3 prongs? And somebody will look at me and go, the fork? And I go, yeah, can you pass me the fork? It was that pronounced for me, which, as you can tell, I'm someone that talks a lot. I'm really pretty well-spoken. That was hard. And I explained to a GP that I was really struggling with this, and her reaction was, oh, yeah, that's a worry. We're going to have to keep an eye on that. Okay, well, look, you've been through all of this and you're taking these medications. Let's consider that. I drove home going, fuck, I've just survived cancer. And now I've got Alzheimer's. Like, that was literally what I thought I was going to have to deal with next.
Today I'm joined by Sonya Lovell, founder of Stellar Women by Sonya, a menopause educator, speaker, and host of the powerful podcast Dear Menopause. After being diagnosed with breast cancer in her 40s, Sonya underwent a lumpectomy, chemotherapy, and was thrust suddenly into medically induced menopause. It was a confronting experience, one that left her feeling unprepared, unsupported, and searching for answers. Since then, Sonya has made it her mission to change the way we talk about menopause. Through her podcast and advocacy work, she shares honest conversations, expert insights, and personal stories to help other women feel seen, supported, and informed. In this episode, she opens up about her life after cancer, the challenges of navigating early menopause, and the lessons she's learned from listening to hundreds of women's stories, including her own. Let's get into it. Sonya, thank you so much for joining me today in the podcast. I've been dying to have you for ages. You're such a trailblazer in this menopause space in Australia. So thank you for making the journey up to visit me.
Thank you, Shauna. It is an absolute pleasure to be here today.
So, Sonya, tell us a little bit about who you are and how you've ended up being such an advocate in this space.
My story goes back to really where I stepped into this space was about 2017. So, well, no, it was actually a little bit longer than that, but it was a pinnacle moment that happened in 2017, which was when I was diagnosed with breast cancer. So prior to that, I had been incredibly healthy personal trainer, living the dream. I once gave a speech which I used the hashtag blessed. That was literally how my life felt. And I was super fit. I was super healthy. I had 2 amazing children. I still have 2 amazing children. Everything was amazing. And then I got this diagnosis of breast cancer, literally out of the blue, as I'm sure most cancer diagnoses probably are.
Can I ask how old you were?
I was 47.
Okay.
Yeah. And everything in my life changed from that moment onwards. Literally from the moment you sit in the chair and get the diagnosis, there's just this significant shift in everything. Obviously, I went through my treatment for that, which we'll go into later. Then a couple of years later, when I was feeling, a little bit physically more stable, emotionally more stable, I went back to work as a personal trainer. And one of the beauties of personal training is that your clients age with you. So I was running small classes, had these beautiful group of women together, and I realized they were all bitching and complaining about the same things. And I realized that what they were all bitching and complaining about was exactly what I had experienced and was experiencing still as a result of my induced menopause. But they were coming into all of this from a natural perspective. I'm a natural-born researcher, and I'm incredibly curious. And so I went off on this rabbit hole of research, basically, to find out how I could support them as their trainers, to understand what was going on and help them seek support and all that sort of thing, which led me to realize that I knew that I had been incredibly unsupported and unprepared and uneducated through my induced menopause, but that the average woman who was experiencing a natural menopause and what I then came to learn was perimenopause were just as unsupported and just as uneducated. I guess I got a bit of a bee in my bonnet about wanting to solve this problem, problem solver as well as being curious. And I also did a lot of research and discovered that the conversation wasn't really being had here in Australia. But there was a huge conversation happening in the US, and there was a huge conversation happening in the UK. And I started following certain people. Some of my clients actually recommended people that they'd learned from, most of them that were expats. So they were like UK-based women living in Australia, but had all these connections back. And so they were seeing what was happening over there. And I was, I guess, smart enough to realize that that was going to happen here eventually. It was like I describe it as like seeing this wave of information and awareness and change that was coming towards us. And I wanted to be ahead of the wave. I didn't want to be behind the wave. So I launched my podcast at that point in time, which was against the advice of a business coach I had at the time, who was like, no, 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 don't. You need to grow an audience first, and you need to establish yourself as, somebody to be heard in this space before you do that. And I was like, no, this is how I'm going to establish myself in this space. And I was just really passionate about doing it. And I'm really grateful that I followed my instinct, and I did. So I launched the Dear Menopause podcast.
And how long ago was that?
That was pretty much about 3 years ago now.
Okay,
Yeah.
amazing. And it's now one of the most listened to podcasts, which is incredible.
I'd like to think so, but it's definitely one of the first podcasts that launched in Australia on the topic of menopause and perimenopause. Yeah.
Okay. If you don't mind, I'd love to just deep dive a little bit more into your story and your experience, because I think the story and narrative of women who go through cancer and menopause is definitely not one that's often talked about, but of course it's so common because unfortunately cancer is common.
Yeah.
So I'd love to for you to explain a little bit about what that journey looked like for you, even if you're happy to share a little bit about your breast cancer journey and what that looked like. And then I'd love us to have a bit of a chat about, those sort of unique difficulties that people with a cancer diagnosis and menopause face.
Yeah, sure. So I suppose the natural place to start is probably my breast cancer diagnosis, and because that was what led to my menopause. So, as I mentioned earlier, I was 47. I found a lump in my breast in the shower. I've always been, for some great reason now, someone that had always checked my breast monthly. I don't know whether I read it in a health magazine somewhere that that's what you should do, and I just did it religiously. And I discovered a lump in my breast one morning in the shower. I will admit that I did ignore it for the first 2 months. The third month, I was like, this is I think this is changing, and I probably should get this checked. So I took myself off to my GP and had her do a check, which led to obviously a mammogram, which led to an ultrasound, which led to a biopsy, which led to a diagnosis. And then all of that actually happened within about a week. So I often describe it as like literally you get put into this train that's at a station, and then someone closes the door and the train leaves the station, and you don't know when you're getting off and you don't know where you're going, and you're just kind of on this journey. So yeah, that all happened really quickly. And there's 2 reference points to an induced menopause that at the time really I paid no attention to whatsoever. So the first was when my GP gave me my diagnosis, and from the perspective of the person sitting in the chair across a table from a GP, a little bit like you and I are right now, she delivered the news, as I guess is probably the best way to do it, which is like ripping the Band-Aid off. And it was like, Sonya, I'm really sorry, but, it has come back. You do have cancer. Then she turned to my husband, who I'd taken with me to the appointment, and said, and I'm really sorry, Paul, but it also means Sonia's going to go into menopause. By the time that was said, I had started tunneling down into this, closing down almost of, it's the trauma that kicks in. And I hadn't actually even remembered that she said that to me until I was putting together my evidence for the Senate inquiry, probably going back about 18 months ago now. Yeah, so that was the first mention, but nothing clicked with me. It was just like this throwaway comment.
Isn't it interesting that she felt the need to apologize to your husband about that?
Yeah, in retrospect, there is so much wrong with that. And I would like to hope, it's 8 years ago now, that things have changed, that doctors, whether they're male or female, deliver these sorts of information with a little bit more empathy. But, I hear stories all the time that also make me think that hasn't changed. But yeah, it was really indicative of so much of the misogyny that does exist in the medical system that I was yet to discover. So that was the first time that it was brought up. The second time it was brought up was my first meeting with my oncologist, and he was because I had a lumpectomy, so I was able to let what they call breast conserving surgery now. So I kept my breasts, but I had surgery to remove the lump. Then, based off the pathology from my lump, I then was kind of put on a path of chemotherapy and radiotherapy, and they knew that there'd be adjuvant therapy at the end of that. So my first meeting with my oncologist to discuss my plans for chemo, he said to me, given your closeness in age to the average age of menopause, which I now know is 51, and I was 47, it's likely that you'll go into an induced menopause. That was it. And I, again, in that trauma kind of filled space, just nodded and went, okay, cool, thanks. Like it literally meant nothing to me. I also recognize now that as a woman who is 47, I hadn't experienced any perimenopausal symptoms or anything that I'd recognized was perimenopause. My period had been absolutely consistent every month after month after month. Like I said, I was super fit and super healthy. So there was absolutely nothing on my radar about menopause. So it literally meant nothing to me when he said, and you'll go into menopause because of your age. And it wasn't until I had my last period between my surgery and my chemo starting. And it's a really weird thing because you don't know that's going to be your last period. I mean, nobody knows if any period is going to be their last period, but I didn't mark it. I didn't have any recognition of the fact that I would never have a cycle again. And it kind of makes me sad now to reflect back on the fact that I lost that sense of my womanhood was changing, if you like. I was transitioning from, a fertile mum and somebody that had successfully carried pregnancies and, all of that sort of thing into this whole other phase of life. So I feel kind of ripped off now a little bit that I lost that opportunity. Um, and I wasn't supported by my MDT, my multidisciplinary team, around what it actually meant for me physically, emotionally. Everybody is so caught up in trying to save your life because you have cancer, and there was just no support. I was literally just left with these horrendous symptoms that by the time I kind of got to the point where I could start unraveling what was going on, I was on the adjuvant therapy. So I'd gone through chemo, I'd gone through radiotherapy. I started having really horrendous hot flushes and night sweats during my radiotherapy. And, when I mentioned it, it was kind of put down to it being because of the radiotherapy. I did have some acupuncture at that point to try and kind of manage those because I was really struggling with them. But again, it wasn't really put down to menopause. It was put down to radiotherapy. And then, you finish your radiotherapy and I went straight on to tamoxifen. So I went straight on to my adjuvant therapy. And nobody even explained to me all of the symptoms and side effects of taking tamoxifen. Like I said, everybody is just so caught up in telling you that they're saving your life because of cancer. And I was struggling. I have this really vivid memory of sitting on the edge of the couch with my husband ended up sitting beside me. And I was absolutely sobbing. Like I'm not a crier, I'm not a big crier. And I was messy crying. It was ugly crying. And what I was crying about was the fact that my body had changed physically, but I hadn't created that change. I hadn't suddenly started eating burgers every night for dinner and, drinking 5 bottles of wine a night and, let my health slide. I'd literally gone from being a healthy person to being somebody that felt like the woman I had never been before. I was overweight. I was depressed. I know all of this now. At the time, I didn't. And I was traumatized. I was angry with my body for doing this to me, which is so messed up that I was in this place where I was blaming my physical body for creating a situation that I then had to fix.
Do you think there's something that creeps in with people who've had cancer, that the medical team are, as you say, so busy about saving your life, and perhaps everyone around you wants you to be so grateful that
Mhm.
you're not dying, that your symptoms are kind of dismissed?
Oh, 1000%. Yeah, I can remember, so I'd have regular checkups with my oncologist between, my chemo sessions, during my radiotherapy, and then once I'd started the adjuvant therapy, and I would go in to see him with this big list of on my notes on my phone of all the things that I was struggling with. And I remember at one appointment, I think it was when I was on the tamoxifen and I was really struggling, and I cried. It was the one time that I cried in front of him, and, I said, I hate this. I feel awful." And he went, "Well, Sonia, my job is to save your life." And that was it. That was the only comment that he had to me sitting in front of him crying. And he'd met me when I was well, before they made me unwell through the treatment, which I'm grateful that I was able to have. But there was just no empathy. There was no support. It was literally, I was dehumanized and I was just this physical being that they had to save. And that was it. And yes, I should be grateful that that was what was happening.
So challenging. So many patients have, explained and articulated that. And I've even walked that journey with a very good friend recently. And it's so challenging. There's obviously been lots of focus on, retraining and further training GPs. But like, it seems to me, to be honest, that it's nearly every specialty in medicine needs the retraining. It's not just the GPs, it's actually everyone. And actually, oncology is a massive one.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because, I very much was very, very well when I was diagnosed with my cancer. And it was the treatment for the cancer that made me unwell and made me sick. It wasn't even at that point for me, it wasn't the cancer that made me sick, it was the treatment. And there has to be some responsibility from those that are prescribing and managing you during that treatment to look after and support every aspect of your health. And it's not just physical health, the emotional health is the psychological health is, huge. It took me way too long to go into counseling and get support. It took the death of a really close friend to trigger me into that. And that was far too long after I'd suffered so much before I even took that step.
Sonia, for anyone listening, what is tamoxifen and why are we giving it to so many women with cancer?
Oh, you're the doctor?
I'd just love to know what
Well,
your understanding
yeah,
is.
no, it's a great question, and my natural reaction to that is like, tamoxifen is the devil, which is not true for anybody that has to take it because it is a necessary evil, I guess, for one. I truly hope that one day down the path there will be better options for women. But tamoxifen is an adjuvant therapy that acts on the cells in the breasts. So there's different types of adjuvant therapy. For me, I took two different types. I took tamoxifen and I'll come back to your question in a second, but when I was 12 months post having had my last period, my oncologist, we did the blood test, my FSH had raised, and I was like, "Oh, okay, cool, you're now postmenopausal. That's great because now we can take you off tamoxifen and we can put you onto letrozole." I was like, "Okay, cool." Letrozole for me was so much worse than tamoxifen, and I'll explain the differences between the two in a minute, but letrozole literally sucked every last piece of estrogen out of my body overnight, and I couldn't get out of bed, I couldn't weight bear on my feet, before I'd, really warmed up my joints because I had so much joint pain. I went from being a, "Yeah, doing okay" 48-year-old to a 90-year-old woman that thought this was what the rest of her life was going to be like. It was horrendous. So the differences are tamoxifen works on the cells in your breasts like a little bit of a lock and key so that the estrogen receptors, if there are any tumours growing, the estrogen receptors can't connect and therefore create recurrence. Letrozole is actually just literally shuts down all of your estrogen production. So rather than being targeted to the breasts, it's your entire system just is deprived of estrogen. Tell me if I'm wrong.
You're doing a great explanation.
Cool. The side effects for me from tamoxifen, which I thought was bad until they put me onto letrozole, really mimics what perimenopause and menopausal symptoms are, but they don't tell you that's what it is. So I had unbelievable brain fog. My cognitive function declined significantly. I spoke to so many just different GPs. So one of the, I guess, kind of complications for me was my GP, who had been my GP for about 17 years at that point, retired the week of my last chemo treatment. So when I got to that point with my MDT where everything was all signed off and it was like, okay, cool, you've done all your treatment now, we're handing you back to your GP. I actually didn't have a GP to be handed back to because she'd retired in that space, and I hadn't had cause to go and see another GP because I was being so well looked after by my MDT. I then had to go and find a GP. So it was a lot of trial and error for me finding a GP that I was happy with to look after me post coming out of all my treatment. But with the variety of GPs that I did road test, I explained to one of them that I was having these really significant cognitive issues. And one of them for me was I was forgetting words. And so literally every fifth or sixth word in a sentence I would forget. And it would be silly things like I'd be sitting at the dining table and I'd be going, can someone pass me the silver thing with the 3 prongs? And somebody would look at me and go, the fork? And I go, yeah, can you pass me the fork? It was that pronounced for me, which, as you can tell, I'm someone that talks a lot. I'm really pretty well-spoken. That was hard. And I explained to a GP that I was really struggling with this, and her reaction was, oh, yeah, that's a worry. We're going to have to keep an eye on that. Okay, well, look, you've been through all of this and you're taking these medications. Let's consider that. So then I went home going, can I swear on your podcast?
Go for it.
Good. I drove home going, fuck, I've just survived cancer and now I've got Alzheimer's. Like, that was literally what I thought I was going to have to deal with next. So severe cognitive function issues. I was having horrendous night sweats, hot flushes during the day, joint aches and pains, strange random skin rashes that I'd never experienced in my life. So dry, itchy skin. One of the most significant symptoms, or almost actually a disorder that I've been left with that I didn't know at the time was a thing, and it took me way too long to get diagnosed and treated for, is lichen sclerosis. So that's to do with vulva health. So obviously I was struggling with a lot of GSM and vaginal changes in vagina and vulva changes as well. So I really ran the full gamut of, and that was all a combination of the changes to my body because of tamoxifen, but also the induced menopause. And that's where it becomes really hard to unpick what's causing what.
As someone who went straight from pregnant to menopausal very quickly, my skin really, really deteriorated quite rapidly. Now, I'd always had a sensitive skin, but my barrier function deteriorated and I developed really very obvious rosacea. And this is something that I see day after day in my clinic also. So many of you reached out and asked what I recommend and why. I have to say that since I opened my clinic, I've been using a brand called Rationale. They're an Australian brand that have been around for about 30 years. And what I absolutely love about Rationale is the products. They feel very luxurious, but they're extremely scientifically derived. And they've got these ingredients called skin identical formulations. All the ingredients, the minerals, the vitamins, everything that's included, the proteins, the lipids have all been found naturally within the human body, and therefore they're recognized by the body. So the ingredients are really, really well received. I find that menopausal skins and perimenopausal skins are dry, irritated, and sensitive. And with this range, I'm able to create a bespoke skincare plan for my patients. If you're interested in getting some of these amazing products, head to rationale.com and use the code U, YOU at checkout to receive some exciting bonus samples with your order. In terms of, you obviously have this career as a personal trainer, obviously a real relationship with your body in terms of eating well, looking fit, feeling fit. How did that relationship with your body change during all of this time?
Significantly. As I said, I spent a lot of time being angry at my body for what I deemed to be letting me down and creating this problem that I then had to solve because I was no longer fit. I actually did continue to train as best as I could during my chemo sessions. I'd read a lot about the benefits of continuing exercise, particularly strength training, and doing what you could. So I did what I could, but it was, nowhere at the level that I had been used to and, which I've now got myself back to. I had fallen into the habits of not caring about what I ate because when I was having chemo, nothing made me feel good anyway. Toast was often on high rotation because that was the only thing that kind of felt comforting and okay. I really, really became very angry with my body and very upset that I had lost so much of who I was. And I define my life now into before breast cancer and after breast cancer because they are two very different states for me, physically, emotionally, career-wise, everything. But my relationship with my body, I had to, understand that it had shifted, B, learn how to accept the changes that had happened. And there's a lot of gratitude that comes with that of, okay, I have this incredibly strong body that has, delivered 2 children and allowed me to have this career and do amazing things in my 40s. But now I have a body that's keeping me alive and it was able to survive cancer and it was able to survive chemotherapy and I can, get back to where I was. It just took a lot of time. So there was a lot of counseling. I did some energy healing. And there was a lot of working with, I have the most amazing strength and conditioning coach who also really kind of does a little life coaching for me as well. And there was a lot of work with her around body acceptance and not being angry with my body, actually being grateful that I have this incredible body that does allow me to move in the way that I move every day through the world.
Okay. And so in terms of the next part of the journey, so you're on all these awful medications, they're in really simple terms, making your estrogen literally as rock bottom can be, and you're having these really florid symptoms. What was the next step for you in a journey towards not feeling? Because clearly feeling lousy like that long term wasn't really going to feel like an option.
No, not for me, it wasn't. Yeah. So the first thing I did was I refused to take letrozole any longer. So I went in and had a very tough conversation with my oncologist and said to him, I am not taking this anymore. What are we going to do? And the language I'm going to use makes me feel physically ill, but this was kind of how I have to describe it. He allowed me to take a 6-week break to kind of flush everything out of my system and to allow me to kind of feel better about everything. But at the end of that 6 weeks, I had to go back onto something, but I could decide whether it was tamoxifen or letrozole. So I took the 6 weeks, felt fantastic by the end of it, of course, and decided to go back onto tamoxifen because the thought of going back onto letrozole was just so horrendous. So I did go back onto the tamoxifen. In total, my prescription from a long-term perspective and management of any potential recurrence was that I would do a minimum of 5 years on tamoxifen or on adjuvant therapy, and then we'd reassess, but ideally they wanted me to be on it between 8 and 10 years. I got to year 4 and took myself off it. Now, this isn't some advice that I give to anyone. This was a very personal decision that I made because I wanted to feel better. I knew that to function in the world the way that I wanted to function in the world, I needed to start taking back control of how I felt physically and emotionally. And so a part of that decision-making process was to go off tamoxifen. It took a long conversation with my husband, and I never went back to see my oncologist. And so that was, 4 years I did of it. So I was 5 years post my diagnosis at that point, pretty much anyway. Um, I'm somebody that has a fairly, like I take risks. I'm not someone that's adverse to taking risks. And I've come to realize that when I talk about my choice to stop taking my adjuvant therapy and my choice to take HRT, which is where we'll go in a second, um, really comes down to the fact that I was able to weigh up the risks for me personally. And therefore, this is a conversation that's very, very different for every single person that experiences breast cancer, that experiences menopause or an induced menopause, and then is making decisions about how they want to treat themselves. But I did make the decision to stop taking my tamoxifen. For me, my fear of recurrence was less than my fear of having to live out the rest of my days with a diminished quality of life. If I'm going to be alive, which I am now, very happily. That sounds ridiculous. I never wasn't alive. But I now know that, I'm back to living a very healthy, happy life. I want to be able to live that feeling the best that I can possibly feel. I've got 2 kids. I've got a husband. We've got a great life. I don't want to be partially participating in that because I feel so shit because of, a fear of recurrence or having to take this medication that was making me feel so ugh. So stopped taking the tamoxifen. By then I was doing my podcast. I was starting to connect with some amazing people. I'd been introduced to the likes of Dr. Louise Newson, the work of Dr. Blomfeld, and I'd met Corinne Menn, who is an incredible OBGYN in the US, who's a breast cancer survivor herself. And I started to educate myself on what my actual risk of recurrence was and what the implications of estrogen and my hormones were. So my breast cancer was estrogen and progesterone positive, right? So you are told, or you're led to believe very strongly, that because of my hormone receptive cancer, I couldn't have any hormone therapy. At one point in time, I even believed I couldn't have soy or I couldn't have food that had estrogens in it. And, there's this huge fear that's created in breast cancer patients and survivors, particularly those with hormone positive cancers, that anything estrogen or progesterone related after that is evil and it is designed to kill you and it is going to kill you. And so therefore you must stay away from everything at all costs. And that is, I now know, so incredibly wrong. When I learned and understood that and read the research papers, because I am, very evidence-based and I don't just go, oh, well, she said this, therefore. I go do my research and I want the research, want to be able to read the research. And when I realized that estrogen doesn't cause cancer. If you have a tumor that's growing that has positive receptors, then it will use estrogen as fuel. Understand that. But estrogen doesn't cause cancer. And so I was like, well, then why is everyone telling me I can't take it? This really sucks. And so I did my research. I am so incredibly lucky to be able to have a conversation with Dr. Louise Newson, to have a conversation with Dr. Corinne Menn, to find a GP that would support me. And it did take many GP conversations to find that person. I had so many doors slammed in my face when I said, I want to have a conversation about having HRT. Nope. Sorry, you're a breast cancer survivor, not possible. I was like, well, actually, it is possible. Can I share some research with you? No. And I'd go, okay, cool. And I'd walk out the door and I'd never go back. And I know that that's such a similar experience that so many women are having out there. But I refused to take no for an answer. And I just kept knocking on doors until I found a fantastic GP who does support me and is willing to have a conversation where I make the decision. Well, we make joint decisions, but I lead the decision-making process. And as long as she's comfortable that I am educated and I know what my risks are versus the benefits and vice versa, that's okay.
Did you have any pushback from your husband or family? Were they like freaking out because of what they thought they knew or believed?
Yeah, my husband. I didn't include anyone else in the conversation from a family perspective. It was very much a conversation between my husband and I. First of all, I made the decision. And then when I was ready to go, okay, I'm actually going to go and get this prescription now. I sat down and had a conversation with him, and we are very, very different people. He is much more risk adverse. So he immediately kind of flipped out. And then I was like, no, look, I want you to listen to this, and I want you to read this, and I want you to understand that this is how I feel now, and I don't want to feel like this anymore. And this is how I believe I'll feel once I start taking the hormone therapy, and that's how I want to feel. And he did his due diligence. He went and listened to the things I asked him to listen to. He read the stuff, and he came back and goes, okay, I support you. This is your decision. Thank you for, help allowing me to be part of the decision-making process. He goes, just so you know, my priority is to have you healthy and living with me for as long as you possibly can. And this is what we're going to do. Then as long as they're monitoring you, which was the other thing, that I was also very conscious of. I have my regular mammograms and ultrasounds every 12 months. I get my bloods done consistently to make sure that I'm not, massively overdosing on any of my hormones. Everything is checked regularly, and I tick all the right boxes. So it was hard for him to wrap his head around it, because he does come from a different risk kind of profile than me, or risk-taking profile. But he fully supported me once he understood why I wanted to do that.
And so what does menopausal hormone therapy look like for you, and how quickly did you feel a bit better?
So I take estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. I have this great story that I share in terms of how quickly it made me feel better. I was in the kitchen. This is about a week after I'd started taking it. So this is like really quick. I was in the kitchen cooking, which I do a lot of. It's my happy place, in my kitchen, cooking for my family. And my husband must have been out somewhere, and he walked back in the kitchen door, or the door of the house, which opened onto the kitchen, and he stopped in his tracks, and he looked at me, and he went, "You're singing." I went, "Yeah." So I had music playing, and he goes, "I haven't heard you sing in the kitchen for years." And I kind of stopped, and I went, "Really?"
Oh, wow.
And he goes, "Yeah." He goes, "You're happy." And I kind of went, "Oh shit, I am." And as much as I knew I was happy, what I didn't realize was that I hadn't been happy. So I thought I was doing okay. Other than the physical stuff, and I'd gone through all my therapy and was working, thought that I was doing really well emotionally, I'd actually not realized how unhappy I still was. And that indication to him of like, whoa, like, you're back.
Color was back in the room.
It really was. And it took him to point that out to me. But that was how quick that was, within a week. And I messaged my GP, and I was like, "Oh my God." And she was like, "Yes, this is what I was hoping for." And I was like, "Yeah." And look, I haven't looked back since. We have our sex life back. I am happy. I'm more confident. And look, hormone therapy is not a silver bullet, which we have to talk about. I'm on top of my nutrition. I'm on top of my exercise, my lifestyle choices. I don't drink alcohol anymore. That stopped well before I started HRT, when I realized there was a significant link between drinking alcohol and my night sweats and my hot flushes. So I don't drink alcohol anymore. I've probably got a fairly plain, boring life in that respect, that I tick all of the lifestyle boxes, as well as the HRT, which is just the icing on the cake. And I'm in a really good place. I feel great.
It's such an amazing story. Just on that point, some people listening might be a little bit sort of freaked out by your decision making, but I've had many patients who've made the same decision for different symptom reasons. But the reality is, for example, drinking alcohol is actually and very risky in terms of breast cancer. It's one of the high risk things that you can do, and yet no one seems to overthink too much their wine drinking or whatever. So it is interesting about how we've been informed about potential risks, and how other risks are really underplayed to us.
Yeah.
Whenever in actual fact, for breast cancer, drinking
Yeah.
is a big risk.
It is. It's a huge risk. It's much riskier than taking HRT, even for a breast cancer survivor. And it's interesting that, what I mentioned about how the fear was driven into me as an estrogen positive cancer survivor, that HRT was evil and it couldn't be taken, and, any estrogen substance, herbal medicine, food, yet nobody actually said to me, whatever you do, don't drink alcohol.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's nuts.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of, I mean, obviously you've been so generous at sharing your experience. In terms of vaginal hormones, some people get a little bit confused about that one. Is it HRT? Is it not HRT? Is it different? Do you need both? Or do you mind me asking, are we using systemic and vaginal hormones? I mean, I think everyone should be on vaginal hormones. Well,
So do I.
not them, but maybe. Is that something that helped? Because I know that you said that you had a lot of that genital urinary syndrome of menopause.
Yep.
One of my issues is with as a GP and also personally is that as a woman, once you start to feel a little bit better, it's very easy to go, oh, I probably don't need that anymore. And you can get lulled into this false sense of security. And then, 6 weeks down the line, you're back feeling miserable again.
Yeah.
But is that something that you have had to navigate with regard to your breast cancer diagnosis? Because, of course, the little box of vaginal hormones comes with a leaflet that's very
Black
scary.
label warning.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and you know what? It's interesting because when you asked me what my HRT protocol was, I didn't include my vaginal estrogen in that because to me, it's just something I do every day regardless. Like it's not part of my HRT. It is part of my HRT, but in my brain it's not because it's not on the same level, I guess, of where people have fear. But it still took me a long time to get vaginal estrogen prescribed to me, even though my most significant symptoms in many respects were GSM related, like, having to progress to the point where I had lichen sclerosis and having to have the most horrendous biopsy I've ever had done in my life because there was a fear that had actually become cancerous as well when I was first diagnosed because it had been left so long. It was ridiculous that there is so much more fear around vaginal estrogen when it's so safe.
And the dose is so tiny, but it's
And it's
so
not
life-changing.
systemic.
It's so life-changing.
So it's life-changing in so many respects. Like it has a huge impact, obviously, on your physical health, your physical comfort, but it also has a huge effect on your relationship. When you finally feel better from a sexual perspective, like that has a huge shift in your relationship. Yeah, absolutely. Vaginal estrogen should just be in the water.
Kelly, I love Dr. Kelly Casperson. She calls it skincare for down
She
there.
does.
So, and I think that's probably how we should think about it.
Absolutely. And actually, that's probably closer to how I think of it. It's just part of my skincare routine.
And tell me what made you decide to use testosterone and what's your experience been like that? Did you get a quick response to that or was it more of a slow burn response from your testosterone?
That's a really good question that I can't answer specifically. So why I was very adamant that I wanted testosterone to be a part of my HRT when I went and had that conversation with the GP that has been supporting me, because of what I'd read, the research, anecdotal research, because I know that one of the big bugbears with testosterone is there is no clinical research that, outside of it being prescribed for HSDD, and you can say that because I always get it wrong, is I knew from the anecdotal evidence and the leading clinicians worldwide that were using it as a part of their protocol that there were significant cognitive impacts. There was significant energy production impacts. I know enough about physiology to understand that, testosterone is an important hormone. And so I was really keen on that right from the get-go. Now, I went against the advice of my GP, who gave me my prescriptions for all three hormones and said, stagger how you start these so that we can actually, monitor what's changing and what's not. And I went home and started everything all at once. So I'm not a model patient in that respect. So it has actually made it hard for us to work out what has impacted what. But, look, I am just so happy with how I now function on all three that I would never see any reason to stop any of them.
Okay, amazing. Talking about your podcast, who have you or what have you learned the most from during those episodes?
Wow. What have I learned the most? So one of the things to understand about my podcast for anybody that hasn't listened to it is Every episode of my podcast is an interview with either a leading expert on a particular topic or lived experience. So it's not just me. I have so much pushback internally against doing solo episodes. But it's also, when I first started the podcast, that was always my model. Like, I am not the expert. I am just a fierce advocate. I have my lived experience. I want to bring the people that are the experts to the table for other people to hear. So what I think I've learned the most is how generous so many clinicians are with their wisdom and their knowledge and their empathy. The ones that want to come on and talk on the podcast, they want to make a difference in the lives of, everybody that they can possibly reach. And obviously they can't get every woman in Australia through their clinic. So it's like a podcast is a great way to reach as many ears as possible. So it's the generosity of clinicians, but it's also the incredible generosity of those that have come on and shared their lived experience as well. Like, humans blow me away. Not always in a good way, but everybody that I've had on my podcast has blown me away in a good way.
Amazing.
Yeah.
What piece of advice, or what do you think that maybe partners, friends, and family could do better? I hate to say it like that, but what do you think people listening who maybe have a family member who's going through a cancer diagnosis, or in fact even just going through peri or postmenopause for whatever reason, what do you think that people could do to help their person a bit more?
I'm going to give you two answers to that. The first answer is educate yourself. Like, learn as much as you can about what they're going to experience, what they are experiencing, so that you have a better understanding of how to support them. The other part of it is, and look, we can't stress this enough, just because their active treatment finishes. So for me, the end of my active treatment was radiotherapy. I'd gone through 8 months of active treatment. Just because that's finished, it doesn't mean they're better. And I think there's this perception in society from people that haven't experienced having to go through those sorts of treatments and life changes. And it's a part of, I'm going to say, toxic positivity, because, and it does come from a good place with 99% of the people, but there is so much healing that needs to take place. For me, it took 3 years after my active treatment finished before I could definitively say I'm in a really good place emotionally and physically and spiritually. Like, 3 years from when that finished. Yet there is this belief that you finish your active treatment and great, you can go back to work, you can go back to being a mum, you can go back to, participating in community, and you've done the hard part. But for me, the hard part actually came afterwards.
I agree. I think there's a real societal expectation to, put your smiley face on and you've survived and you beat it, and it's all like this kind of warrior language of,
Yeah.
you've won the war,
And that's the language that so much is used. You're in this fight against cancer, and it's not a fight ever. And I really push back against that warrior, like you said, kind of language, and the way people kind of try and make it like you fought this war and then you won, and so cool, let's go celebrate. That's not like that at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for anyone listening who is on a journey with themselves or with another person, I think often the mental battle happens long after the last treatment, and maybe even the bell's been rung at the oncology ward. Actually, the mental battle begins after that, coming to terms with a life that's different, and also a life that's often just constant scanning, blood tests, and this worrying, and also, I suppose having faced your own mortality, when perhaps it's something that most people never really think about.
Yeah.
Like yourself, I'm very passionate about, obviously, cancer survivors and the genetic previvors and how they navigate this space. I've been lucky, like you. I've had Dr. Corinne Mann, Avram Blooming, Carol Tavares for the Estrogen Matters, all on the podcast. And I feel like there's lots of people who are still desperate for more information. They nearly want someone to be able to tell them what to do. And that's the really hard thing, isn't it? Like, no one can actually tell you what to do. It's about finding the information and the facts that we have right now, which a lot of the time are imperfect,
Mm-hmm.
and then making the best decision for you. And even if you had like two identical twin sisters who both had the same diagnosis, they might interpret
Yeah.
what to do next
Yeah.
very differently.
And I think the other thing to add to that too is to have some flexibility with your thinking, where if you do make a decision, like let's say you do decide that you don't take HRT because, your fear of recurrence is so high, but you can change your mind. At some
Agree.
point, one of the best things I heard, and I can't remember whether it was Dr. Mary Claire Haver or Kelly Casperson, but one of them said, you can try HRT for a week, 2 weeks, a month, and then you can decide to stop taking it, and it literally is out of your system overnight. And so it works both ways. Like, you can decide you're never taking HRT and, tell all your friends that. But if you decide 6 months down the track that actually you do want to give it a try, absolutely you can. It doesn't matter what you said. It doesn't matter what you put out into the world. What decision you make is what matters. And the same if you do decide to try it and then you either don't feel better or the fear of recurrence becomes overwhelming, then just stop taking it.
100%. Yeah, you absolutely nailed it. And I think that's right. People end up feeling like they've boxed themselves
Into a decision.
and
Yeah.
that they've told all these people that they're not going to do X or Y. And then how do they possibly extract themselves out of it?
Yeah.
Don't care.
I can give you a really good example of that from my own life. Back when I was very early in my personal training days, and everything was all about the keto diet, or not the keto at that point in time, it was actually the caveman diet, paleo. Everything was paleo, and everything was natural health. And I went to a seminar, and I can't even remember who he was, but he was an American that had come out and was speaking. And I went home and I said to my husband that night, oh my God, if ever I get cancer, just so you know, I'm refusing chemo. I will never have chemo. It is evil. Like, society has been brainwashed into thinking that, it's this great thing, but it's actually just awful. And he actually said to me, oh my God, don't say that. Like, seriously, what are you thinking? And then I was put into the position where I had to decide, years later, and my thinking had evolved, but I still, at that point in time, would have preferred to use natural medicines over, going to a GP and getting a prescription for something. I had to make a decision as to whether I had chemo or not. And that was actually a really hard decision for me to make. And I spent a lot of money on getting testing sent to the US to prove that I needed to have chemo. It was a oncotype test, and it was I did everything I could to prove to myself that I had to have chemo, because it was a really hard decision for me to make, to have it. And it was because I'd made this comment, years and previously, about how I would never have chemo, and chemo saved my life.
I know, absolutely. We all just have to be open and honest about changing our mind. And I think that's probably one of my learnings in life is I was probably, as I was younger, I was quite rigid with the I will never do this, I will never do that. And now I've realized, oh, I appear to be doing that I said I would never do. And so thank goodness I can just ignore what I said before. It's so lovely having someone who does have that great personal training background and, of course, lived experience. 1 or 2 tips for someone going through cancer treatment at the minute. What exercise can they do? Should they do? What might be helpful?
Yeah, look, the first thing is be guided by your specialist, obviously, because your treatment's going to be very unique to you, and what your fitness level was like before you, went into treatment as well. If you're somebody that's never stepped foot in a gym before, and all of a sudden someone's telling you to go in and lift weights, that's definitely not going to be possible whilst you're undergoing chemo or any type of treatment. Firstly, be guided by your specialists, obviously. But the evidence definitely does show that doing as much exercise as you can during your treatment, so continuing to be active. If you are someone that is used to being in the gym and lifting weights, continue to do that at a level that feels right for you on the day, and that is going to differ day to day. If you're someone that is used to being a runner, then, continue to run. Do whatever you're used to doing, just you will have to have an expectation that's got to be pared back a little bit, but continue to move. That's the most important thing.
There's lots of stuff on social media where people are joking about how eating protein is now their full-time job and strength training is also taken up all their time. Um, Tell me why and it's probably something that you knew for years, but the rest of us obviously were a bit slower to the party.
Yeah.
What have we suddenly realized, and why are we focusing so much on strength training in women at this time of life?
It's a really good question because you're so right. It has definitely been a shift. I'm someone that has lifted significantly heavy weights since I was in my late 30s when I first got introduced to strength training. There's a funny joke that you're either a lifter or a runner, and I've always been a lifter. I do kind of find it comical that all of a sudden everybody's jumped on the strength training train. I think what we've realized is, as a society, our bone health is so important. And it's our muscles that significantly impact how strong our bones are. And, we talk, I think also the conversation has shifted a lot into longevity as well. And we now, we know that everybody is living longer, everybody is living healthier for longer. And, there's this sense of wanting to live healthier for longer as well. And to do that, you have to have a physically strong body. We all have stories in our generation of family members that have had falls and broken hips, and, osteoporosis is just, rife. We also come from a generation that was significantly impacted by diet culture, and that has significantly impacted either how people exercise or what they've eaten, and the impact that has had on their bones as well. So I think bone health and a desire to live healthier for longer is what's driving a lot of the push now to understand how beneficial strength training is.
And so if you're a woman who has never done weightlifting or any kind of strength work, where on earth do you start? Like, do you go to Kmart and buy yourself a couple of pink dumbbells, or where on earth do you start?
I think the most important thing is to start. And I also am a huge advocate for getting some professional help when you do start. I'm not going to lie, I feel a little concerned when I see certain doctors, surgeons that have very high social media profiles talking about how everybody should lift heavy shit all of the time. And if you don't, then you should start, because I think there's a huge piece of the puzzle that's missing for women that have never, and men, anybody that's never lifted anything heavier than maybe their grocery shopping bags, to suddenly jump to lifting heavy shit, if you want to call it that. And it can actually be quite dangerous to the body, to the musculoskeletal system. You can overload your spine really easily. You can, do yourself a knee injury really easily. Lower back specifically, if you're lifting heavy, can be really vulnerable. Pelvic floor is a massive problem, particularly for women. If you don't have a strong pelvic floor and you're not engaging your pelvic floor when you're lifting, you're going to do more damage to your pelvic floor, and you're also going to potentially damage yourself as well. So you have to be careful with how you start. I think that's probably what I'm trying to say. And if you find that buying a pair of 2-kilo dumbbells at Kmart is your lowest barrier to entry, then knock yourself out. Go and buy the pink 2-kilo dumbbells and start with those. Most importantly, know that progression is going to come and is what's actually needed to create that change in your muscles, which is going to flow onto your bones. So you can't continue to use those 2-kilo dumbbells for the rest of your life. You're going to have to, we call it progressive overload. So you're going to have to learn to go up to the 4-kilo dumbbells, and then to the 6-kilo dumbbells, and then perhaps push to the 10-kilo dumbbells, but then sometimes know it's okay to come back to the 6-kilo dumbbells and then go back up to the 10-kilo dumbbells. There's a progression that has to happen to get the benefits of the muscle growth, which is going to impact your bone health. That's probably the most important thing to learn.
Okay, amazing. Sonya, you have been so generous. My final question is to you is, what piece of advice would you give to 20-something Sonya if you were able to talk to her?
I actually had a moment of clarity driving up here where I went, do you know what I did a lot of in my 20s? People pleasing. I did a lot of people pleasing. I did a lot of worrying about what other people thought about me and factoring that into my decision-making process. I don't do that anymore. And look, that is a benefit of menopause. It's a benefit of going through a traumatic, life-changing
Event.
Thank you.
I got you.
You did. That was the cognitive function slipping. I would tell 20-year-old Sonya to stop pleasing all the people and worrying about what other people think, because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what other people think. All that matters is that you can sleep with yourself at night with the decisions that you made that were right for you.
You are so right. Do you feel like you are less of a people pleaser and more into pleasing Sonya?
Oh, yeah. And my husband would agree with that as well. We have this funny thing where my husband is amazing, and we've been together for 30 odd years, and he says these really beautiful things to me at home, like he says, "God, you're amazing. Like, you're just such an incredible woman. I'm so glad that I married you." And I go, "I know." And he looks at me and goes, "Oh my God."
And then loves you even more.
Yep.
I love it. Sonya, thank you so much.
Shauna, thank you. It's been a great conversation. Thank you for asking me.
You are so welcome. This podcast and any information, advice, opinions, or statements within it do not constitute medical, healthcare, or other professional advice. Information is provided for educational and entertainment purposes only. If you have any health concerns, always consult your doctor.